My day job is building a cyber risk management solution. Where did I get my inspiration? How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk, authored by Doug Hubbard and my good friend Richard Seiersen. Doug joined Business Security Weekly to provide a sneak peek into the second edition of the book. Doug shares more research data, free tools, and new concepts like FrankenSME. If you're a risk management professional or want to learn more about risk management, enjoy this interview with a slice of pumpkin or pecan pie.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
From the Security Weekly Vault, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Doug Hubbard is the inventor of the Applied Information Economics method and founder of Hubbard Decision Research. He is the author of many books, including How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. Doug's career has focused on the application of applied information economics to solve current business issues facing today's corporations. He has completed over 200 risk-return analyses of large critical projects, investments, and other management decisions in the last 25 years. AIE is the practical application of several fields of quantitative analysis, including Bayesian analysis and Monte Carlo simulations. Doug, welcome back to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
I love conversations with you. So first, I have to give a little background, right? You and Richard Seiersen wrote How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. Richard and I go way back. I was telling you the story, which you didn't know. Richard and I used to live in the same little small town in Colorado called Larkspur. He was at Kaiser at the time. I was at Qualys. And they were one of our main design partners for the policy compliance module that we built at Qualys. That's how we realized that we lived like 2 miles from each other. So I've known Richard a long time. The book in this first version had great success. Our data scientist here at Living Security is actually a huge fan of the book and both of you because we have actually implemented a lot of what's in that book in our human risk index calculations that we use here at Living Security. So it's always fun to have you come on so we can geek out about risk algorithms. But you also are updating the book to its second edition, which I think is kind of cool. And so I want to cover a little bit about, what's new in the book. But feel free to start with kind of a primer on the first book.
Yeah, sure. Well, we basically tried to make the case that you really ought to be doing the math when it comes to quantifying risk in cybersecurity. That a lot of the shortcut methods that people use, the risk matrix, you guys are all familiar with, the scores rating something on a scale of 1 to 5, and Richard makes the joke that it's sort of like orange times birds plus 5 times fish equals Pee Wee Herman or something. It doesn't, there's no real math there. It's all pseudo math. And it does actually make people feel better. There's actually some research on this. And I expounded on that research a little bit more in the second edition of my second book, The Failure of Risk Management. But there does appear to be something called an analysis placebo. An analysis placebo is where you adopt some method that seems structured and formal, and you feel better about your estimates and decisions, even when they're measurably worse than they were before. So this will happen anytime you have highly delayed and inconsistent feedback on your decisions and estimates. So you don't get immediate feedback in cybersecurity risk if you say that's 5% likely per year to occur. You don't get immediate feedback on whether or not that was a good assessment or not. So we have to assess things in different ways, more like an insurance company would assess it. I haven't died yet, but they still are able to figure out a life insurance premium for me, right? So they use different methods. They cast a broader net and they interpolate. But when we use these isolated methods where we just use qualitative judgment, subjective is okay, by the way. There's nothing wrong with subjective. We use lots of subjective estimation methods, but they're quantitative subjective. And some subjective estimation methods are measurably better than others. So why not use the best practices there? So there's been a lot of research on that. We don't have to guess at that kind of stuff. But it looks like, based on all the research that we talked about in the first edition and even some of the additional research that we added to this edition, that any benefit from a risk matrix or these qualitative methods is really just an illusion, an analysis placebo. So in the first edition, we spent some time talking about here's a simple solution that you could do instead of that. So it still relied on subjective but quantitatively explicit estimates, but measurably better. All right. You actually remove some of the error in the qualitative methods just by not doing, weighted scores or rating likelihood on a scale of 1 to 5. That actually introduces error of its own. So even though we're still subjective at first with this first simple model, the model we call the 1-for-1 substitution, every dot on the risk matrix becomes a row in this table, becomes the input for a simulation. So we can substitute every dot on the risk matrix with an actual line item in a Monte Carlo simulation, and we've removed some of the error already. It's still subjective, but once we start speaking the language of quantitative methods, well, then we can do things like Bayesian updates. We can do Monte Carlo simulations. We can compute return on control. We can answer questions like, is this an acceptable level of risk given my quantified risk aversion? I don't know how you do that on risk matrix, but yes, you can do the math on that. And we didn't really have to invent anything. Every component that we make as part of our solution is a component that's been tested in other fields. We just pulled them together to make a procedure.
Yes, absolutely. And we're using some of those pieces, right? When you think about Bayesian analysis and calculating probabilities of risk around certain events and factors, right? We're actually implementing those. You bring up a very good point, right? I remember the early days of GRC, right? I Control Path was kind of one of my startups. We spun it out. And I spent a lot of years in the governance, risk management, and compliance space. We loved that risk matrix. We absolutely loved it. Now, I didn't love it, which is why I actually authored a patent around math to actually calculate risk. It was its own kind of thing back in the day, but that was before we started to take really the research that was being done in the risk management space and figured out how to apply it, which I think you guys have done a really good job of bringing some of that research and some of that data into the industry. I mean, Richard's been a big fan of this. There's been other methodologies out there over the years, but the ability to bring proven algorithms and approaches in is I think we started to finally realize we're not that unique in cybersecurity. At least we shouldn't be that unique in cybersecurity.
That's a really good point. I remember when we had just written the first edition of this book, we were at RSA. Actually, I don't think the book had quite come out yet. We were just announcing it at RSA. We had a packed room because Jack Jones actually, in his session, said, "Hey, go check out this next session that Richard Seiersen and Doug Hubbard are doing." And we had a packed room. And so we're talking about what's going to be in the book. And actually, it wasn't out quite yet. And I remember a lot of interesting things about that RSA convention. We'd run into so many people who kept on telling us over and over, and Richard objected to all of these, but he objected to all of them. But I kept on hearing that cybersecurity was unique, that it was in fact the most complex endeavor humankind had ever come across. That it was beyond any quantification attempts at all. It was more complicated, and I'm not exaggerating. It's more complicated than economics, than literal brain surgery. Okay, so these are things that people said to me, and yes, and I responded with as much disbelief as you could imagine. Really? And what's amazing to me is a lot of the people who said those things never actually worked in any other area except maybe some software development. And I'm sure compared to software development, it probably did seem pretty complex and unpredictable, even as unpredictable as software development can be. But cybersecurity, where you've got intelligent adversaries, that seemed to be, more difficult for them. Even the fact that there are intelligent adversaries, that was touted as something unique about cybersecurity. I said, there's other areas where there's intelligent adversaries. I mean, that's not a new thing either, right? Do insurance companies have to insure against fraud, theft, kidnapping, all of that? How about military? Do we do any analytics there? I happen to know for a fact that we do, because I wrote about some of that in my first book, because the Marine Corps hired us to do their battlefield fuel forecasting. So we developed the algorithm they use for the battlefield fuel requirements. So yeah, they do lots of math in each of those areas, and they all have intelligent adversaries. So that wasn't unique. Technology changes quickly. That's another one that comes up. Well, technology changes quickly in lots of areas. One client of ours is aerospace, one of the big aerospace clients. And we've had several big pharma and medical device clients, including some right now. That's pretty complicated. Technology is changing pretty fast. And all of these IT startups that we've done work for. So to us, when we look at all the things we've done with the big environmental policy analysis we did for the United Nations and the EPA, and the big risk return analysis for major new mergers and acquisitions and prioritizing R&D portfolios, and it was all Greek to me. I'm not the expert in any of these fields. I mean, I can tell you a lot about potash mining in Canada now because we had a project doing that. And maybe I can talk like an amateur about radar development in aerospace because we were prioritizing R&D portfolios in that space. And even in some cases, certain kinds of drug development or medical device development. And interestingly enough, cybersecurity on medical devices. That's a pretty important area, it turns out. Yep. I mean, we're always the outsiders. So we see all these different areas, and I do hear this. I don't want to pick on cybersecurity too much because I've heard it from multiple people that their area is uniquely complex compared to everybody else. So, and I just say, well, you're all unique. You're almost uniformly unique. Like
Doug,
trillions of others in the place, right? So,
first off, Doug, having served in the United States Marine Corps, thank you for helping us out and serving. Serving the military. Your expertise is something much needed. So I just wanted to thank you, having served in the Marine Corps, for that.
Well, I appreciate that. It was an honor, I'll say, and I'm sure I did a lot more good than a rather old field artillery officer at that time.
Agreed.
So,
100% agreed. Some of us, those of us who've been in the industry for a while, know that we're not unicorns, right? When it comes to it. But what I've seen over the course of my career is that one of the biggest problems is security doesn't understand the business, and the business in many instances doesn't understand security. So we're not speaking each other's language, right? And I had the benefit over the course of my career to work with some really great leaders, some really great CEOs, CFOs. And, the easy button is that risk matrix. That's the easy button to walk in the door. But, when you're challenged by a CFO or a CEO, when you bring that risk matrix and you use red light, green light, yellow light as your, as your alerting mechanism and your data you're bringing to the table. At one point in my career, when I was very young in my career, I had a CFO say to me, listen, I'm going to put it to you simply, kid. I need to know if the squeeze is worth the juice. And then we sat down and we talked about, do we have an accurate asset inventory? Do we have assigned value to that asset inventory? Can you help me calculate our exposure, right? Can I expect what my losses would be if I were to have an outage or if those assets would go down? What's the likelihood of that to occur on an annual basis? So that CFO taught me how to do quantitative analysis by sitting me down and saying, listen, what you're bringing to the table is just surface. It's easy button. We need to understand this a lot better. So I got a lesson in the business. I got a lesson in what the CFO, the CEO, and the board want to know so they can make good business decisions, so they can talk about risk appetite and risk tolerance. So for me, it's, for the cybersecurity leaders who are sitting here, we fought really hard to get a seat at the table. Well, with that fight comes responsibility. Learn the business. Get a mentor in the business. Partner with the CFO.
I think CFOs were some of my early advocates when I started doing these sorts of things. So even before we started doing anything with cybersecurity, we were helping big companies and governments prioritize IT portfolios. So the big IT investments, the new software development. And they were doing these things where they would rate different attributes of the various projects with high, medium, low kinds of stuff and colors and things like this. And I remember a CFO telling me secondhand about a conversation he had with a previous CIO at a previous job where the CIO said, this is a medium, that's a high, that kind of stuff. And he said, well, I tell you what, I'm going to go down to accounting and I'm going to make sure on your next paycheck it says medium instead of whatever the dollar number is. And would that be acceptable? So, the CFO was trying to obviously make the case that I want to know what the return on this investment is. And in cybersecurity, we use the term return on control. Am I going to get $1 million worth of risk reduction if I spend $1 million on this? Right. So that's a legitimate question. We should all be asking those questions. And after I've spent my budget on risk reduction, is the remaining risk acceptable or should I seek more funds? How do I answer that question? Right. Those are answerable questions. We know how to figure them out. There's rational ways to approach those questions.
Interesting. One of the areas that I think a lot have struggled with is the uniqueness of their organization and that one mathematical equation does not fit all, right? And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the subjectivity factor, right? Where everybody thinks they're so unique. How can you standardize an algorithm in our space like cybersecurity, but give some level of customization and flexibility without destroying the underlying model? Is that possible, Doug? Because we hear all the time, like, we're so unique that I have to be able to tweak this, this, and this. Are there ways to do that, but keep the core of the model together and be able to produce consistent results?
Oh, sure. Well, math itself isn't one equation, right? Look at all the different rockets and planes that are all out there, and they're all based on physics, Newtonian physics and thermodynamics. Those are all different. So they have the same fundamental principles, right? But they develop all these different systems, fascinating different systems for completely different purposes. And they're still based on actually kind of a finite handful of equations, right? Obviously, you're plugging different values into those things and so forth. But there's another angle to that question. One way to ask the question like that is, does using my intuition or a qualitative method alleviate any of that complexity or uniqueness or lack of data or uncertainty in any way at all? And it doesn't. So this is an important point to make. Number one, you're modeling. You're modeling anyway, whether you're using math or a risk matrix or your intuition or flipping a coin or astrology, you're modeling. So everybody's modeling and none of them are right. All models are wrong. A famous statistician, George Bach, said, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. I try to add the corollary that some are measurably more useful than others. Okay, so they're all wrong. That's why we call them models and not reality. All right. But some models are measurably less wrong. And since we're going to model, you have no choice about that. Walking up a flight of stairs involves a model. Okay. So you are modeling. The only question is which modeling method is less wrong than the other. And there's actually a phenomenon I came across when I was doing the research on the second edition of the second book again. It's called algorithm aversion. There's a general tendency to hold algorithms to a higher, tighter standard than our intuition or qualitative methods. So if we are asked to compare the performance of different modeling methods, and we're asked to choose between different modeling methods for different purposes, and we're rewarded for making better bets in some way, people appear to be more forgiving of errors from human experts in qualitative methods than they would of quantitative methods, even though the quantitative method made smaller and fewer errors than the alternative. They simply just seem to be holding the algorithm to a higher standard. And if you don't meet that standard, I default to a clearly inferior modeling method. Well, that's obviously irrational. We've been calling it the ex opere ursus fallacy for quite a while before I came across the research that actually had an academic name for it, algorithm aversion. So ex opere ursus, you might have gotten from the book. That's Latin for beat the bear. I got that from Google Translate. I don't speak Latin, but I got that from Google Translate. And it's based on that joke of the two guys going ready to go hike in the woods. One guy's got running shoes on, and his buddy says, "Why are you wearing running shoes? We're going hiking." He says, "Well, I wanted to be able to run fast because I heard there were bears in the woods today." The guy with the hiking boots says, "That's absurd. You can't outrun a bear anyway." He says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." Yeah. So the guy with the hiking boots was making an ex supero ursus fallacy. He was thinking that he's supposed to beat some ideal standard. Now, all you have to do is beat the alternative, right? All you have to do is beat the alternative model. And models like the risk matrix set the bar so low that it's relatively easy for a quantitative model to easily outperform that. All we have to do is just avoid some of the errors it introduces.
Right.
We don't even have to outperform expert intuition to do better than the risk matrix, because the risk matrix actually introduces errors that intuition alone didn't have. You're actually better off, and this may be why the risk matrix doesn't do more damage than it does, is because people periodically ignore what it says anyway. So if they actually followed, the procedure that they so carefully defined for using their risk matrix, they would probably make worse bets. Fortunately, they have the sense to disregard it when it doesn't make sense. And so now we're really competing with intuition. And that's not a bad model. Intuition is not a bad model, but it is the baseline we have to outperform. In fact, we have to outperform it by enough to justify the effort in the new model. So the new model is going to cost something, so I have to do better than the intuition by enough to justify that additional effort. A return on analysis is what we would call it.
Got it. So give us some of the highlights of what's in the second edition. We talked through a bunch of them on the pre-call, but like, what's new in the book? Why should somebody go out and get the second edition if they read the first edition?
Well, and before you answer that, maybe if I could ask, I'm kind of curious, what makes you decide to do a second edition? Is it the level of success of the first book, or do you go back 4 years later, reread it, and get angry enough that you decide you want to rewrite some major parts of it, and second guess it? Or have you just made progress in how you would answer certain questions and present certain models?
I think all of the above. I mean, I've said this for years, but one of the reasons why I've written so many books is I keep thinking of stuff I wished I would have written in other books. And then every time I do that, I write another book. And the other secret to writing a lot of books is you forget each time how much work the previous books were. And so it's
like having a child, right?
To a big project. Yeah, it's exactly. What a great idea. Let's have another child. Let's write another book. And you forget how much work it is. But there obviously, cybersecurity, and my publisher was very interested in this because obviously lots of things happen in cybersecurity. And so there's a little bit of news to update on that. And from an empirical point of view, there is some new data that changes some of the things we said in the first edition. And we also got a little simpler with the simplest solutions and a little bit more elaborate with the most advanced solutions. So we kind of expanded both directions in the book. It's a little bit thicker, this one. It's going to be a little bit thicker. So there's going to be more for people to pick from. In fact, we have an answer that doesn't even involve a Monte Carlo simulation. So there's an initial estimate, simplifying lots of things. Obviously, you have to leave out a lot of detail to simplify stuff, but it's at least explicitly quantitative. So you are still avoiding some of the errors that the risk matrix introduces. One of the empirical findings that's a little different is in the first edition, we were having trouble finding in the empirical data any evidence that there's any lasting effect on stock prices due to cybersecurity breaches. It looked like after a cybersecurity breach, a big public announcement of a cybersecurity breach, it looked like stock prices went down half the time. They went up half the time. And the amount of change was consistent with historical volatility. You couldn't tell by looking at the stock chart whether they ever announced the stock price. And this would be for all sorts of firms. But there are a few differences. So when you look at somebody like, let's say, SolarWinds, all right, their stock price did drop quite a lot, but they're in a different role, right? So they're pushing out software, and that software had some bad code in it. If you're a retailer like Target or Home Depot, Apparently, that doesn't really affect people's buying habits, even though they might say on a survey, like they did after the Target breach quite a few years ago, oh, I'm never going to shop there again. Apparently, the Ponemon Institute survey indicated that about 8% of respondents in their survey said they would never shop at Target again. Well, you can't tell by looking at their quarterly reports. It looks just like any other, volatile quarter. But they had lots of historical volatility because, they're competing with Amazon and people like that. So, and Walmart was doing pretty well. So they're competing with all that space. And as you might have heard, places like Sears and JCPenney were having a hard time. So Target's kind of caught in the middle of all of that volatility. And I remember a couple of months after Target, after the major data breach, there was something there was an article in the cybersecurity press that said, oh, Target prices went down by, stock price went down by this much after the announcement of the data breach. Well, then it was up again. They just picked a point in time and said it's down here and it's down because of that. It didn't make any sense. But now when we look at somebody like SolarWinds and a couple of other places that are, where really it's their job to manage your data and so forth, then it makes a big difference. So it depends on the kind of industry you're in. But for most, say, retailers or insurance companies or Merck had a huge, they had all their IP locked up, right? They won the $1 billion plus claim. Chubb was their insurance company on that. Merck's stock price, you couldn't tell the difference. Didn't make any difference at all. So for most people, unless you're in that business where you provide a service that guarantees those sorts of things and people rely on the quality of your software or something, and that's what's actually being infected, well, then it doesn't appear it's a difference. So that's a new one. That's different from what we saw the first time.
What you just hold on. Oh, yeah. So 1 second on that one, Doug, because what you just justified for some companies is it doesn't matter if we get breached or not. It's not going to affect our stock price. I'm not sure that's necessarily the outcome we want, but.
Oh, no, there is a cost to a data breach, but it's not a stock price drop. Yeah. So we say this in the books. We say we're not saying there isn't a cost. We're saying that you're not going to estimate the cost by trying to estimate a stock price drop. That's for most companies. Now there are exceptions, but for most companies, that's not the thing. Most of the cost seems to be relatively measurable easily measurable things like what your fines could be. There's a lot of data on that now, even for GDPR. When the first book came out, GDPR was pretty new, right? There wasn't a lot of data on that. But now there's plenty of data on fines of GDPR. We know exactly what the distribution is as a function of your annual revenue. What percentage of your annual revenue are you likely to be fined? We see the distribution on that. Likewise, other civil liabilities, Advising's got plenty of data on this kind of stuff, and Scientia puts those annual reports together, and they do lots of, for hire work in that analysis. We've worked with Scientia on a couple of projects. So there's really a lot of data on those things now for what the real cost of a cybersecurity breach would be. And another major cost of cybersecurity breach is what Richard and I called the penance projects. And that appears to be a real thing. People spend a lot of money, like T-Mobile right now. They're spending money to alleviate the concerns of their stakeholders. All their customers and shareholders and so forth. They come out and they do a big PR management kind of an issue where they're saying, we're going to revamp all of this stuff. We've responded well. And it appears that if most stockholders and even customers seem to be forgiving if it sounds like you're responding well. It matters if you got breached again a second time the same year. Then they start going, okay, now you're in trouble, right? Or if you tried to cover it up in some way. But if you're just responsible about it and you fix it, for most companies, again, not all, depending on the industry, it appears that the penance projects, maybe they're working, maybe the efforts they spend on that, but that's real money. And what you're really doing when you're estimating reputation damage that way is you're actually estimating your own contingency plans. So after a breach, what do? Do you just sit back and wait for the worst to happen? Apparently not. After a major data breach, there's all these other things you start to do, and that has a cost. marketing outreach, make sure that your customers have, good fraud detection services like All Clear ID. I talk about them in the book. I did that project for them. You spend this other money to minimize what could be much bigger costs. So that penance projects are a real cost, as are the fines and that sort of thing. So it's just a different way to calculate reputation damage.
Yep.
Not
so lots of new data, lots of new updates there. What else is in the book that people should pay attention to in the second edition?
Yeah, so we added that. I mentioned we got simpler on the simple stuff and a little bit more elaborate on the more advanced stuff as well. We expanded both directions. So the simplest item is what Richard was calling the rapid risk audit. So it's just a simple checklist for like a CISO's first day as CISO. Here's a list of things you could go through, still explicitly quantitative. It's not a Monte Carlo simulation because we're only using probability weighted average outcomes. So it's still a good approximation, a step in the right direction. So you can do a little bit more quickly. At the other end of the scale, we added a few new methods. For example, we actually introduce a method for how you can aggregate the estimates of multiple experts. This is an area we've spent some time on now, even outside of cybersecurity. But this is interesting. You might have heard, and this is true, that if you average multiple people together, the average of the group is probably an improvement on their estimate. And that's true because in cybersecurity, about 21% of the variation in expert judgments of probabilities of events is just personal inconsistency. They would have given you a different answer on the next day or something, right? We're not machines. We can't replicate our choices every day using the exact same algorithm every time. So there's going to be noise in our choices. And if we put all of our estimates together in a pool each time, all 5 of us, and we kept on making estimates, in general, those average estimates would be better estimates than any one of us alone. But actually, there's another method for aggregating experts. There's Bayesian methods for aggregating experts, and we've got a set of algorithms we've developed with hybrid machine learning and Bayesian methods, and we came up with some shortcut rule of thumb procedures for replicating that. Doesn't do exactly as well, but this is really interesting. If you had 3 experts that all said that something was, say, 70% likely, and you're saying that X is 70% likely out of a portfolio of things that on average happen about 50% of the time. So we all 4 looked at this one case and we said, oh, that's 70% likely. Well, 3 of it, I happen to know the answer for if 3 people did it. If 3 people independently without communicating with each other said something was 7% likely, what's the chance of it being true? It's about 81, 82%. Why is that? Well, the math shows us, and it agrees with the empirical data because we've tracked this against tens of thousands of individual estimates of probabilities where we knew the actual outcome, right? So we've had lots of people go through our calibration training. We've got tens of thousands of individual estimates of probabilities of events, of people estimating different things. And we can apply the math and we can see the actual outcome, and the math is a really good predictor of the actual outcome. The reason why our combined knowledge is better than any one of ours is because if we appear to agree, we apparently agree for slightly different reasons. So that's sort of like we each sampled some population and we want to estimate the mean of that population based on each of our samples. And I sampled 15 and Matt sampled 20 and Jason sampled 17 and Adrian sampled 8 or something like this. We each have our separate ranges for what we think the mean of the population is. The combined mean, the combined estimate based on all of our samples is actually narrower than any of our individual means. Any narrower than any of our individual estimates of the means. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. We don't just average the upper bounds and average the lower bounds. Do you see what I mean? It's actually narrower than that. So there is, an increase in information when you combine knowledge algorithmically this way. So we call this the FrankenSME method. This is what we've been calling it for a while. I think the nickname's kind of stuck now, so we're just going to keep calling it FrankenSME. But that's what our machine learning and software developer guys were doing, or calling it. So it's fascinating performance. So you've seen the the movie or read the book Moneyball?
Mhm.
Seen that?
Yep.
So they were trying to recreate Jason Giambi in the aggregate, they say. So they find 3 other players that had complementary stats that together, actually did as well or better than Jason Giambi. They had to recreate him in the aggregate, right? Well, this is kind of what we do with FrankenSME. The FrankenSME is actually measurably better than your best individual SME. So that's cool. That's a new thing. There's just a little bit in the Bayesian updates part.
I like that.
We also added some slightly more advanced methods on how to get started with the lens model and the log odds ratio, because now we've gotten these estimates from lots of clients. So the methods that we've described in the first book, we've actually applied to lots of clients now. And we're combining all of their subjective estimates. And we're saying, how effective is multi-factor authentication? How much do we adjust the likelihood of a particular subsystem being breached or something like that if that's got multi-factor authentication in place? All right. And a few other general categories of controls. How much does that actually change the chance of some event occurring, given all these responses from, well over a dozen different clients now, dozens of individual subject matter experts total among all the clients. So yeah, that's all new.
So when's the book coming out? Do you have a rough estimate on when it's going to be out?
Later this spring. This spring. We're actually trying to turn in the final page proofs of the chapters this week. So that's my other job. When I get off this, I'm going to go back and make sure I've got the final edits on page proofs. So this is the page proofs are the stage where it's almost done. It's all laid out like it's supposed to be printed in the book, and you only get to make the most minor changes after that. Little typos. You don't get to add, whole chapter or anything like that at this stage. So we're going through finding everything we can possibly find, checking all the math and the equations and our formulas and so forth. So that's the stage we're at. And that should be out this week. And we've Richard was working on getting some great endorsements from people to go on the book jacket. So he's got some great ones from CISO at Amazon stores, former Google CISO, former Netflix CISO. So really generous endorsements, actually. So we're going to make a big splash with that. That's for sure. I'm going to milk that for all we can.
Nice.
Absolutely.
We could keep going forever, but you've got a book to edit. We've got to go to our second segment. So, Doug, thank you so much for joining us on Cybersecurity Weekly.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, guys.